Welcome to Timeless Detective Tales. Agatha Christie, the companion, now, Dr. Lloyd, said Miss Hellier. Don't you know any creepy stories? She smiled at him, the smile that nightly bewitched the theater-going public. Jane Hellier was sometimes called the most beautiful woman in England, and jealous members of her own profession were in the habit of saying to each other, "Of course Jane's not an artist. She can't act, if you know what I mean. It's those eyes." And those eyes were at this minute fixed appealingly on the grizzled elderly bachelor doctor, who, for the last 5 years, had ministered to the ailments of the village of St. Mary Mead. With an unconscious gesture, the doctor pulled down his waistcoat, inclined of late to be uncomfortably tight, and racked his brains hastily, so as not to disappoint the lovely creature who addressed him so confidently. "I feel," said Jane dreamily, "that I would like to wallow in crime this evening." "Splendid," said Colonel Bantry, her host. "Splendid, splendid." And he laughed a loud, hearty military laugh. Dolly?" His wife, hastily recalled to the exigencies of social life, she had been planning her spring boarder, agreed enthusiastically. "Of course it's splendid," she said heartily but vaguely. "I always thought so, did you, my dear?" said old Miss Marple, and her eyes twinkled a little. "We don't get much in the creepy line, and still less in the criminal line, in St. Mary Mead, you know." "Miss Hellier," said Dr. Lloyd. "You surprise me," said Sir Henry Clithering. The ex-commissioner of Scotland Yard turned to Miss Marple. "I always understood from our friend here that St. Mary Mead is a positive hotbed of crime and vice." "Oh, Sir Henry," protested Miss Marple, a spot of color coming into her cheeks. "I'm sure I never said anything of the kind. The only thing I ever said was that human nature is much the same in a village as anywhere else, only one has opportunities and leisure for seeing it at closer quarters. But you haven't always lived here," said Jane Hellier, still addressing the doctor. "You've been in all sorts of queer places all over the world, places where things happen." "That is so, of course," said Dr. Lloyd, still thinking desperately. "Yes, of course. Yes. Ah. I have it." He sank back with a sigh of relief. "It is some years ago now, I had almost forgotten. But the facts were really very strange indeed, and the final coincidence which put the clue into my hand was strange also." Miss Hellier drew her chair a little nearer to him, applied some lipstick and waited expectantly. The others also turned interested faces towards him. "I don't know whether any of you know the Canary Islands," began the doctor. "They must be wonderful," said Jane Hellier. "They're in the South Seas, aren't they? Or is it the Mediterranean?" "I've called in there on my way to South Africa," said the colonel. "The Peak of Tenerife is a fine sight with the setting sun on it." "The incident I am describing happened in the island of Grand Canary, not Tenerife. It is a good many years ago now. I had had a breakdown in health and was forced to give up my practice in England and go abroad. I practiced in Las Palmas, which is the principal town of Grand Canary. In many ways I enjoyed the life out there very much. The climate was mild and sunny, there was excellent surf bathing, and I am an enthusiastic bather, and the sea life of the port attracted me. Ships from all over the world put in at Las Palmas. I used to walk along the mole every morning, far more interested than any member of the fair sex could be in a street of hat shops. As I say, ships from all over the world put in at Las Palmas. Sometimes they stay a few hours, sometimes a day or two. In the principal hotel there, the Metropole, you will see people of all races and nationalities, birds of passage. Even the people going to Tenerife usually come here and stay a few days before crossing to the other island. My story begins there, in the Metropole Hotel, one Thursday evening in January. There was a dance going on and I and a friend had been sitting at a small table watching the scene. There were a fair sprinkling of English and other nationalities, but the majority of the dancers were Spanish, and when the orchestra struck up a tango, only half a dozen couples of the latter nationality took the floor. They all danced well and we looked on and admired. One woman in particular excited our lively admiration. Tall, beautiful and sinuous, she moved with the grace of a half-tamed leopardess. There was something dangerous about her. I said as much to my friend and he agreed. Women like that, he said, are bound to have a history. Life will not pass them by. Beauty is perhaps a dangerous possession, I said. It's not only beauty, he insisted. There is something else. Look at her again, things are bound to happen to that woman, or because of her. As I said, life will not pass her by. Strange and exciting events will surround her. You've only got to look at her to know it. He paused and then added with a smile, just as you've only got to look at those two women over there, and know that nothing out of the way could ever happen to either of them. They are made for a safe and uneventful existence. I followed his eyes. The two women he referred to were travelers who had just arrived. A Holland Lloyd boat had put into port that evening, and the passengers were just beginning to arrive. As I looked at them I saw at once what my friend meant. They were two English ladies, the thoroughly nice traveling English that you do find abroad. Their ages, I should say, were round about 40, one was fair and a little, just a little, too plump, the other was dark and a little, again just a little, inclined to scragginess. They were what is called well-preserved, quietly and inconspicuously dressed in well-cut tweeds, and innocent of any kind of make-up. They had that air of quiet assurance which is the birthright of well-bred English women. There was nothing remarkable about either of them. They were like thousands of their sisters. They would doubtless see what they wished to see, assisted by Baedeker, and be blind to everything else. They would use the English library and attend the English church in any place they happened to be. And it was quite likely that one or both of them sketched a little. And, as my friend said, nothing exciting or remarkable would ever happen to either of them, though they might quite likely travel half over the world. I looked from them back to our sinuous Spanish woman with her half-closed smoldering eyes and I smiled. Poor things, said Jane Hellier with a sigh. But I do think it's so silly of people not to make the most of themselves. That woman in Bond Street, Valentine, is really wonderful. Audrey Denman goes to her, and have you seen her in The Downward Step? As the schoolgirl in the first act she's really marvelous, and yet Audrey is 50 if she's a day. As a matter of fact I happen to know she's really nearer 60. Go on, said Mrs. Bantry to Dr. Lloyd. I love stories about sinuous Spanish dancers. It makes me forget how old and fat I am. I'm sorry, said Dr. Lloyd apologetically. But you see, as a matter of fact, this story isn't about the Spanish woman, it isn't? No, as it happens my friend and I were wrong. Nothing in the least exciting happened to the Spanish beauty. She married a clerk in a shipping office. And by the time I left the island she had had 5 children and was getting very fat, just like that girl of Israel Peters, commented Miss Marple. The one who went on the stage and had such good legs that they made her principal boy in the pantomime. Everyone said she'd come to no good, but she married a commercial traveler and settled down splendidly. The Village Parallel, murmured Sir Henry softly. No, went on the doctor. My story is about the 2 English ladies. Something happened to them, breathed Miss Helier. Something happened to them, and the very next day, too. Yes, said Mrs. Bantry encouragingly, just for curiosity. As I went out that evening I glanced at the hotel register. I found the names easily enough. Miss Mary Barton and Miss Amy Durrant of Little Paddocks, Cotton Weir, Bucks. I little thought then how soon I was to encounter the owners of those names again, and under what tragic circumstances. The following day I had arranged to go for a picnic with some friends. We were to motor across the island, taking our lunch, to a place called, as far as I remember, it is so long ago, Las Nieves, a well-sheltered bay where we could bathe if we felt inclined. This program we duly carried out, except that we were somewhat late in starting, so that we stopped on the way and picnicked, going on to Las Nieves afterwards for a bathe before tea. As we approached the beach, we were at once aware of a tremendous commotion. The whole population of the small village seemed to be gathered on the shore. As soon as they saw us they rushed towards the car and began explaining excitedly. Our Spanish not being very good, it took me a few minutes to understand, but at last I got it. 2 of the mad English ladies had gone in to bathe, and one had swum out too far and got into difficulties. The other had gone after her and had tried to bring her in, but her strength in turn had failed and she too would have drowned had not a man rowed out in a boat and brought in rescuer and rescued, the latter beyond help. As soon as I got the hang of things I pushed the crowd aside and hurried down the beach. I did not at first recognize the 2 women. The plump figure in the black stockinette costume and the tight green rubber bathing cap awoke no chord of recognition as she looked up anxiously. She was kneeling beside the body of her friend, making somewhat amateurish attempts at artificial respiration. When I told her that I was a doctor she gave a sigh of relief. And I ordered her off at once to one of the cottages for a rub-down and dry clothing. One of the ladies in my party went with her. I myself worked unavailingly on the body of the drowned woman. Life was only too clearly extinct, and in the end I had reluctantly to give in. I rejoined the others in the small fisherman's cottage and there I had to break the sad news. The survivor was attired now in her own clothes, and I immediately recognized her as one of the 2 arrivals of the night before. She received the sad news fairly calmly, and it was evidently the horror of the whole thing that struck her more than any great personal feeling. "Poor Amy," she said. Poor Amy. She had been looking forward to the bathing here so much, and she was a good swimmer too. I can't understand it. What do you think it can have been, doctor? Possibly cramp. Will you tell me exactly what happened? We had both been swimming about for some time, 20 minutes, I should say. Then I thought I would go in, but Amy said she was going to swim out once more. She did so, and suddenly I heard her call and realized she was crying for help. I swam out as fast as I could. She was still afloat when I got to her, but she clutched at me wildly and we both went under. If it hadn't been for that man coming out with his boat I should have been drowned too. That has happened fairly often, I said. To save anyone from drowning is not an easy affair. It seems so awful, continued Miss Barton. We only arrived yesterday, and were so delighting in the sunshine and our little holiday. And now this terrible tragedy occurs. I asked her then for particulars about the dead woman, explaining that I would do everything I could for her, but that the Spanish authorities would require full information. This she gave me readily enough. The dead woman, Miss Amy Durrant, was her companion and had come to her about 5 months previously. They had got on very well together, but Miss Durrant had spoken very little about her people. She had been left an orphan at an early age and had been brought up by an uncle and had earned her own living since she was 21, and so that was that, went on the doctor. He paused and said again, but this time with a certain finality in his voice, and so that was that. I don't understand, said Jane Hellier. Is that all? I mean, it's very tragic. I suppose, but it isn't, well, it isn't what I call creepy. I think there's more to follow, said Sir Henry. Yes, said Dr. Lloyd, there's more to follow. You see, right at the time there was one queer thing. Of course I asked questions of the fishermen, etc., as to what they'd seen. They were eyewitnesses. And one woman had rather a funny story. I didn't pay any attention to it at the time, but it came back to me afterwards. She insisted, you see, that Miss Durrant wasn't in difficulties when she called out. The other swam out to her and, according to this woman, deliberately held Miss Durrant's head under water. I didn't, as I say, pay much attention. It was such a fantastic story, and these things look so differently from the shore. Miss Barton might have tried to make her friend lose consciousness, realizing that the latter's panic-stricken clutching would drown them both. You see, according to the Spanish woman's story, it looked as though, well, as though Miss Barton was deliberately trying to drown her companion. As I say, I paid very little attention to this story at the time. It came back to me later. Our great difficulty was to find out anything about this woman, Amy Durrant. She didn't seem to have any relations. Miss Barton and I went through her things together. We found one address and wrote there, but it proved to be simply a room she had taken in which to keep her things. The landlady knew nothing. Had only seen her when she took the room. Miss Durrant had remarked at the time that she always liked to have one place she could call her own to which she could return at any moment. There were 1 or 2 nice pieces of old furniture and some bound numbers of Academy pictures, and a trunk full of pieces of material bought at sales, but no personal belongings. She had mentioned to the landlady that her father and mother had died in India when she was a child and that she had been brought up by an uncle who was a clergyman, but she did not say if he was her father's or her mother's brother, so the name was no guide. It wasn't exactly mysterious, it was just unsatisfactory. There must be many lonely women, proud and reticent, in just that position. There were a couple of photographs amongst her belongings in Las Palmas, rather old and faded, and they had been cut to fit the frames they were in, so that there was no photographer's name upon them, and there was an old daguerreotype which might have been her mother or more probably her grandmother. Miss Barton had had 2 references with her, one she had forgotten, the other name she recollected after an effort. It proved to be that of a lady who was now abroad, having gone to Australia. She was written to. Her answer, of course, was a long time in coming, and I may say that when it did arrive there was no particular help to be gained from it. She said Miss Durrant had been with her as companion and had been most efficient and that she was a very charming woman, but that she knew nothing of her private affairs or relations, so there it was, as I say, nothing unusual, really. It was just the two things together that aroused my uneasiness. This Amy Durant of whom no one knew anything, and the Spanish woman's queer story. Yes, and I'll add a third thing. When I was first bending over the body and Miss Barton was walking away towards the huts, she looked back with an expression on her face that I can only describe as one of poignant anxiety, a kind of anguished uncertainty that imprinted itself on my brain. It didn't strike me as anything unusual at the time. I put it down to her terrible distress over her friend. But, you see, later I realized that they weren't on those terms. There was no devoted attachment between them, no terrible grief. Miss Barton was fond of Amy Durant and shocked by her death, that was all, but, then, why that terrible poignant anxiety? That was the question that kept coming back to me. I had not been mistaken in that look. And almost against my will, an answer began to shape itself in my mind. Supposing the Spanish woman's story were true, supposing that Mary Barton willfully and in cold blood tried to drown Amy Durant, she succeeds in holding her under water whilst pretending to be saving her. She is rescued by a boat. They are on a lonely beach far from anywhere. And then I appear, the last thing she expects. A doctor. And an English doctor. She knows well enough that people who have been under water far longer than Amy Durant have been revived by artificial respiration. But she has to play her part, to go off leaving me alone with her victim. And as she turns for one last look, a terrible poignant anxiety shows in her face. Will Amy Durant come back to life and tell what she knows? Oh, said Jane Hellier. I'm thrilled now. Viewed in that aspect, the whole business seemed more sinister, and the personality of Amy Durant became more mysterious. Who was Amy Durant? Why should she, an insignificant paid companion, be murdered by her employer? What story lay behind that fatal bathing expedition? She had entered Mary Barton's employment only a few months before. Mary Barton had brought her abroad, and the very day after they landed the tragedy had occurred. And they were both nice, commonplace, refined English women. The whole thing was fantastic, and I told myself so. I had been letting my imagination run away with me. You didn't do anything, then? Asked Miss Hellier. My dear young lady, what could I do? There was no evidence. The majority of the eyewitnesses told the same story as Miss Barton. I had built up my own suspicions out of a fleeting expression which I might possibly have imagined. The only thing I could and did do was to see that the widest inquiries were made for the relations of Amy Durant. The next time I was in England I even went and saw the landlady of her room, with the results I have told you. But you felt there was something wrong, said Miss Marple. Dr. Lloyd nodded. Half the time I was ashamed of myself for thinking so. Who was I to go suspecting this nice, pleasant-mannered English lady of a foul and cold-blooded crime? I did my best to be as cordial as possible to her during the short time she stayed on the island. I helped her with the Spanish authorities. I did everything I could do as an Englishman to help a compatriot in a foreign country, and yet I am convinced that she knew I suspected and disliked her. How long did she stay out there? Asked Miss Marple. I think it was about a fortnight. Miss Durant was buried there, and it must have been about 10 days later when she took a boat back to England. The shock had upset her so much that she felt she couldn't spend the winter there as she had planned. That's what she said. Did it seem to have upset her? Asked Miss Marple. The doctor hesitated. Well, I don't know that it affected her appearance at all, he said cautiously. She didn't, for instance, grow fatter? Asked Miss Marple. Do you know, it's a curious thing you're saying that. Now I come to think back, I believe you're right. Yes, she did seem, if anything, to be putting on weight. How horrible, said Jane Hellier with a shudder. It's like fattening on your victim's blood, and yet, in another way, I may be doing her an injustice, went on Dr. Lloyd. She certainly said something before she left, which pointed in an entirely different direction. There may be, I think there are, consciences which work very slowly, which take some time to awaken to the enormity of the deed committed. It was the evening before her departure from the Canaries. She had asked me to go and see her, and had thanked me very warmly for all I had done to help her. I, of course, made light of the matter, said I had only done what was natural under the circumstances, and so on. There was a pause after that, and then she suddenly asked me a question. Do you think, she asked, that one is ever justified in taking the law into one's own hands? I replied that that was rather a difficult question, but that on the whole, I thought not. The law was the law, and we had to abide by it. Even when it is powerless? I don't quite understand. It's difficult to explain, but one might do something that is considered definitely wrong, that is considered a crime, even, for a good and sufficient reason. I replied drily that possibly several criminals had thought that in their time, and she shrank back. But that's horrible, she murmured. Horrible. And then with a change of tone she asked me to give her something to make her sleep. She had not been able to sleep properly since, she hesitated, since that terrible shock. You're sure it is that? There is nothing worrying you? Nothing on your mind? On my mind? What should be on my mind? She spoke fiercely and suspiciously. Worry is a cause of sleeplessness sometimes. I said lightly. She seemed to brood for a moment. Do you mean worrying over the future, or worrying over the past, which can't be altered? Either. Only it wouldn't be any good worrying over the past. You couldn't bring back, oh. What's the use? One mustn't think. One must not think. I prescribed her a mild sleeping draught and made my adieu. As I went away I wondered not a little over the words she had spoken. You couldn't bring back, what? Or who? I think that last interview prepared me in a way for what was to come. I didn't expect it, of course, but when it happened, I wasn't surprised. Because, you see, Mary Barton struck me all along as a conscientious woman, not a weak sinner, but a woman with convictions, who would act up to them, and who would not relent as long as she still believed in them. I fancied that in the last conversation we had she was beginning to doubt her own convictions. I know her words suggested to me that she was feeling the first faint beginnings of that terrible soul-searcher, remorse. The thing happened in Cornwall, in a small watering place, rather deserted at that season of the year. It must have been, let me see, late March. I read about it in the papers. A lady had been staying at a small hotel there, a Miss Barton. She had been very odd and peculiar in her manner. That had been noticed by all. At night she would walk up and down her room, muttering to herself, and not allowing the people on either side of her to sleep. She had called on the vicar one day and had told him that she had a communication of the gravest importance to make to him. She had, she said, committed a crime. Then, instead of proceeding, she had stood up abruptly and said she would call another day. The vicar put her down as being slightly mental, and did not take her self-accusation seriously. The very next morning she was found to be missing from her room. A note was left addressed to the coroner. It ran as follows: I tried to speak to the vicar yesterday, to confess all, but was not allowed. She would not let me. I can make amends only one way, a life for a life, and my life must go the same way as hers did. I, too, must drown in the deep sea. I believed I was justified. I see now that that was not so. If I desire Amy's forgiveness, I must go to her. Let no one be blamed for my death. Mary Barton. Her clothes were found lying on the beach in a secluded cove nearby, and it seemed clear that she had undressed there and swum resolutely out to sea where the current was known to be dangerous, sweeping one down the coast. The body was not recovered, but after a time leave was given to presume death. She was a rich woman, her estate being proved at £100,000. Since she died intestate, it all went to her next of kin, a family of cousins in Australia. The papers made discreet references to the tragedy in the Canary Islands, putting forward the theory that the death of Miss Durrant had unhinged her friend's brain. At the inquest, the usual verdict of suicide whilst temporarily insane was returned. And so the curtain falls on the tragedy of Amy Durrant and Mary Barton. There was a long pause, and then Jane Helier gave a great gasp. Oh, but you mustn't stop there, just at the most interesting part. Go on. But you see, Miss Helier, this isn't a serial story. This is real life, and real life stops just where it chooses. But I don't want it to, said Jane. I want to know. This is where we use our brains, Miss Helier, explained Sir Henry. Why did Mary Barton kill her companion? That's the problem Dr. Lloyd has set us. Oh, well, said Miss Helier, she might have killed her for lots of reasons. I mean, oh, I don't know, she might have got on her nerves. Or else she got jealous, although Dr. Lloyd doesn't mention any men, but still on the boat out. Well, you know what everyone says about boats and sea voyages. Miss Helier paused, slightly out of breath, and it was borne in upon her audience that the outside of Jane's charming head was distinctly superior to the inside. I would like to have a lot of guesses, said Mrs. Bantry. But I suppose I must confine myself to one. Well, I think that Miss Barton's father made all his money out of ruining Amy Durrant's father, so Amy determined to have her revenge. Oh, no, that's the wrong way round. How tiresome. Why does the rich employer kill the humble companion? I've got it. Miss Barton had a young brother who shot himself for love of Amy Durrant. Miss Barton waits her time. Amy comes down in the world. Miss B engages her as companion and takes her to the Canaries and accomplishes her revenge. How's that? Excellent, said Sir Henry. Only we don't know that Miss Barton ever had a young brother. We deduce that, said Mrs. Bantry. Unless she had a young brother there's no motive, so she must have had a young brother. Do you see, Watson? That's all very fine, Dolly, said her husband. But it's only a guess. Of course it is, said Mrs. Bantry. That's all we can do, guess. We haven't got any clues. Go on, dear, have a guess yourself. Upon my word, I don't know what to say. But I think there's something in Miss Heller's suggestion that they fell out about a man. Look here, Dolly, it was probably some high church parson. They both embroidered him a cope or something, and he wore the Durrant woman's first. Depend upon it, it was something like that. Look how she went off to a parson at the end. These women all lose their heads over a good-looking clergyman. You hear of it over and over again. I think I must try to make my explanation a little more subtle, said Sir Henry, though I admit it's only a guess. I suggest that Miss Barton was always mentally unhinged. There are more cases like that than you would imagine. Her mania grew stronger and she began to believe it her duty to rid the world of certain persons, possibly what is termed unfortunate females. Nothing much is known about Miss Durrant's past, so very possibly she had a past, an unfortunate one. Miss Barton learns of this and decides on extermination. Later, the righteousness of her act begins to trouble her and she is overcome by remorse. Her end shows her to be completely unhinged. Now, do say you agree with me, Miss Marple. I'm afraid I don't, Sir Henry, said Miss Marple, smiling apologetically. I think her end shows her to have been a very clever and resourceful woman, Jane Hellier interrupted with a little scream. Oh, I've been so stupid. May I guess again? Of course it must have been that blackmail. The companion woman was blackmailing her. Only I don't see why Miss Marple says it was clever of her to kill herself. I can't see that at all, said Sir Henry. You see, Miss Marple knew a case just like it in St. Mary Mead. You always laugh at me, Sir Henry, said Miss Marple reproachfully. I must confess it does remind me, just a little, of old Mrs. Trout. She drew the old age pension, you know, for 3 old women who were dead, in different parishes. It sounds a most complicated and resourceful crime, said Sir Henry. But it doesn't seem to me to throw any light upon our present problem. Of course not, said Miss Marple. It wouldn't, to you. But some of the families were very poor, and the old age pension was a great boon to the children. I know it's difficult for anyone outside to understand. But what I really meant was that the whole thing hinged upon one old woman being so like any other old woman, said Sir Henry, mystified. I always explain things so badly. What I mean is that when Dr. Lloyd described the 2 ladies first, he didn't know which was which, and I don't suppose anyone else in the hotel did. They would have, of course, after a day or so, but the very next day one of the 2 was drowned, and if the one who was left said she was Miss Barton, I don't suppose it would ever occur to anyone that she mightn't be. You think, oh, I see, said Sir Henry slowly. It's the only natural way of thinking of it. Dear Mrs. Bantry began that way just now. Why should the rich employer kill the humble companion? It's so much more likely to be the other way about. I mean, that's the way things happen. Is it? Said Sir Henry. You shock me. But of course, went on Miss Marple, she would have to wear Miss Barton's clothes. And they would probably be a little tight on her, so that her general appearance would look as though she had got a little fatter. That's why I asked that question. A gentleman would be sure to think it was the lady who had got fatter, and not the clothes that had got smaller, though that isn't quite the right way of putting it. But if Amy Durrant killed Miss Barton, what did she gain by it? Asked Mrs. Bantry. She couldn't keep up the deception forever. She only kept it up for another month or so, pointed out Miss Marple. And during that time I expect she traveled, keeping away from anyone who might know her. That's what I meant by saying that one lady of a certain age looks so like another. I don't suppose the different photograph on her passport was ever noticed. You know what passports are. And then in March, she went down to this Cornish place and began to act queerly and draw attention to herself so that when people found her clothes on the beach and read her last letter they shouldn't think of the common sense conclusion. Which was? Asked Sir Henry. Nobody, said Miss Marple firmly. That's the thing that would stare you in the face. If there weren't such a lot of red herrings to draw you off the trail, including the suggestion of foul play and remorse. Nobody. That was the real significant fact. Do you mean, said Mrs. Bantry, do you mean that there wasn't any remorse? That there wasn't, that she didn't drown herself? Not she, said Miss Marple. It's just Mrs. Trout over again. Mrs. Trout was very good at red herrings, but she met her match in me. And I can see through your remorse-driven Miss Barton. Drown herself? Went off to Australia, if I'm any good at guessing. You are, Miss Marple, said Dr. Lloyd. Undoubtedly you are. Now it again took me quite by surprise. Why, you could have knocked me down with a feather that day in Melbourne. Was that what you spoke of as a final coincidence? Dr. Lloyd nodded. Yes, it was rather rough luck on Miss Barton, or Miss Amy Durrant, whatever you like to call her. I became a ship's doctor for a while, and landing in Melbourne, the first person I saw as I walked down the street was the lady I thought had been drowned in Cornwall. She saw the game was up as far as I was concerned, and she did the bold thing, took me into her confidence. A curious woman, completely lacking, I suppose, in some moral sense. She was the eldest of a family of 9, all wretchedly poor. They had applied once for help to their rich cousin in England and been repulsed, Miss Barton having quarrelled with their father. Money was wanted desperately, for the 3 youngest children were delicate and wanted expensive medical treatment. Amy Barton then and there seems to have decided on her plan of cold-blooded murder. She set out for England, working her passage over as a children's nurse. She obtained the situation of companion to Miss Barton, calling herself Amy Durrant. She engaged a room and put some furniture into it so as to create more of a personality for herself. The drowning plan was a sudden inspiration. She had been waiting for some opportunity to present itself. Then she staged the final scene of the drama and returned to Australia, and in due time she and her brothers and sisters inherited Miss Barton's money as next of kin. A very bold and perfect crime, said Sir Henry. Almost the perfect crime. If it had been Miss Barton who had died in the Canaries, suspicion might attach to Amy Durrant and her connection with the Barton family might have been discovered, but the change of identity and the double crime, as you may call it, effectually did away with that. Yes, almost the perfect crime. What happened to her? Asked Mrs. Bantry. What did you do in the matter, Dr. Lloyd? I was in a very curious position, Mrs. Bantry. Of evidence as the law understands it, I still have very little. Also, there were certain signs, plain to me as a medical man, that though strong and vigorous in appearance, the lady was not long for this world. I went home with her and saw the rest of the family, a charming family, devoted to their eldest sister and without an idea in their heads that she might prove to have committed a crime. Why bring sorrow on them when I could prove nothing? The lady's admission to me was unheard by anyone else. I let nature take its course. Miss Amy Barton died 6 months after my meeting with her. I have often wondered if she was cheerful and unrepentant up to the last. Surely not, said Mrs. Bantry. I expect so, said Miss Marple. Mrs. Trout was. Jane Hellier gave herself a little shake. Well, she said. It's very, very thrilling. I don't quite understand now who drowned which. And how does this Mrs. Trout come into it? She doesn't, my dear, said Miss Marple. She was only a person, not a very nice person, in the village. Oh, said Jane. In the village. But nothing ever happens in a village, does it? She sighed. I'm sure I shouldn't have any brains at all if I lived in a village. The four suspects. The conversation hovered round undiscovered and unpunished crimes. Everyone in turn vouchsafed their opinion. Colonel Bantry, his plump amiable wife, Jane Hellier, Dr. Lloyd, and even old Miss Marple. The one person who did not speak was the one best fitted in most people's opinion to do so. Sir Henry Clithering, ex-Commissioner of Scotland Yard, sat silent, twisting his moustache, or rather stroking it, and half smiling, as though at some inward thought that amused him. Sir Henry, said Mrs. Bantry at last. If you don't say something I shall scream. Are there a lot of crimes that go unpunished? Or are there not? You're thinking of newspaper headlines, Mrs. Bantry. Scotland Yard at fault again. And a list of unsolved mysteries to follow, which really, I suppose, form a very small percentage of the whole, said Dr. Lloyd. Yes, that is so. The hundreds of crimes that are solved and the perpetrators punished are seldom heralded and sung, but that isn't quite the point at issue, is it? When you talk of undiscovered crimes and unsolved crimes, you are talking of two different things. In the first category come all the crimes that Scotland Yard never hears about, the crimes that no one even knows have been committed. But I suppose there aren't very many of those, said Mrs. Bantry, aren't there? Sir Henry. You don't mean there are? I should think, said Miss Marple thoughtfully, that there must be a very large number. The charming old lady, with her old-world unruffled air, made her statement in a tone of the utmost placidity. My dear Miss Marple, said Colonel Bantry. Of course, said Miss Marple, a lot of people are stupid. And stupid people get found out, whatever they do. But there are quite a number of people who aren't stupid, and one shudders to think of what they might accomplish unless they had very strongly rooted principles. Yes, said Sir Henry, there are a lot of people who aren't stupid. How often does some crime come to light simply by reason of a bit of unmitigated bungling, and each time one asks oneself the question, if this hadn't been bungled, would anyone ever have known? But that's very serious, Clithering, said Colonel Bantry. Very serious, indeed, is it? What do you mean? It is. Of course it's serious. You say crime goes unpunished, but does it? Unpunished by the law perhaps, but cause and effect works outside the law. To say that every crime brings its own punishment is by way of being a platitude, and yet in my opinion nothing can be truer. Perhaps, said Colonel Bantry. But that doesn't alter the seriousness. He paused, rather at a loss. Sir Henry Clithering smiled. 99 people out of 100 are doubtless of your way of thinking, he said. But you know, it isn't really guilt that is important, it's innocence. That's the thing that nobody will realize. I don't understand, said Jane Hellier. I do, said Miss Marple. When Mrs. Trent found half a crown missing from her bag, the person it affected most was the Daily woman, Mrs. Arthur. Of course the Trents thought it was her, but being kindly people and knowing she had a large family and a husband who drinks, well, they naturally didn't want to go to extremes, but they felt differently towards her, and they didn't leave her in charge of the house when they went away, which made a great difference to her, and other people began to get a feeling about her too. And then it suddenly came out that it was the governess. Mrs. Trent saw her through a door reflected in a mirror. The purest chance, though I prefer to call it providence. And that, I think, is what Sir Henry means. Most people would be only interested in who took the money, and it turned out to be the most unlikely person, just like in detective stories. But the real person it was life and death to was poor Mrs. Arthur, who had done nothing. That's what you mean, isn't it, Sir Henry? Yes, Miss Marple, you've hit off my meaning exactly. Your charwoman person was lucky in the instance you relate. Her innocence was shown. But some people may go through a lifetime crushed by the weight of a suspicion that is really unjustified. Are you thinking of some particular instance, Sir Henry? Asked Mrs. Bantry shrewdly, as a matter of fact. Mrs. Bantry, I am. A very curious case, a case where we believe murder to have been committed, but with no possible chance of ever proving it. Poison, I suppose, breathed Jane. Something untraceable. Dr. Lloyd moved restlessly and Sir Henry shook his head. No, dear lady. Not the secret arrow poison of the South American Indians. I wish it were something of that kind. We have to deal with something much more prosaic, so prosaic, in fact, that there is no hope of bringing the deed home to its perpetrator, an old gentleman who fell downstairs and broke his neck. One of those regrettable accidents which happen every day. But what happened really? Who can say? Sir Henry shrugged his shoulders. A push from behind? A piece of cotton or string tied across the top of the stairs and carefully removed afterwards? That we shall never know, but you do think that it, well, wasn't an accident? Now why? Asked the doctor. That's rather a long story, but, well, yes, we're pretty sure. As I said, there's no chance of being able to bring the deed home to anyone. The evidence would be too flimsy. But there's the other aspect of the case, the one I was speaking about. You see, there were 4 people who might have done the trick. One's guilty, but the other 3 are innocent, and unless the truth is found out, those 3 are going to remain under the terrible shadow of doubt. I think, said Mrs. Bantry, that you'd better tell us your long story. I needn't make it so very long after all, said Sir Henry. I can at any rate condense the beginning. That deals with a German secret society, the Schwarz Hand, something after the lines of the Camorra, or what is most people's idea of the Camorra. A scheme of blackmail and terrorization. The thing started quite suddenly after the war, and spread to an amazing extent. Numberless people were victimized by it. The authorities were not successful in coping with it. For its secrets were jealously guarded, and it was almost impossible to find anyone who could be induced to betray them. Nothing much was ever known about it in England, but in Germany it was having a most paralyzing effect. It was finally broken up and dispersed through the efforts of one man, a Dr. Rosen, who had at one time been very prominent in Secret Service work. He became a member, penetrated its inmost circle, and was, as I say, instrumental in bringing about its downfall, but he was, in consequence, a marked man. And it was deemed wise that he should leave Germany, at any rate for a time. He came to England, and we had letters about him from the police in Berlin. He came and had a personal interview with me. His point of view was both dispassionate and resigned. He had no doubts of what the future held for him. "They will get me, Sir Henry," he said. Not a doubt of it. He was a big man with a fine head, and a very deep voice, with only a slight guttural intonation to tell of his nationality. That is a foregone conclusion. It does not matter, I am prepared. I faced the risk when I undertook this business. I have done what I set out to do. The organization can never be got together again. But there are many members of it at liberty, and they will take the only revenge they can, my life. It is simply a question of time, but I am anxious that that time should be as long as possible. You see, I am collecting and editing some very interesting material, the result of my life's work. I should like, if possible, to be able to complete my task. He spoke very simply, with a certain grandeur which I could not but admire. I told him we would take all precautions, but he waved my words aside. "Some day, sooner or later, they will get me," he repeated. "When that day comes, do not distress yourself. You will, I have no doubt, have done all that is possible." He then proceeded to outline his plans, which were simple enough. He proposed to take a small cottage in the country where he could live quietly and go on with his work. In the end he selected a village in Somerset, King's Nathan, which was 7 miles from a railway station, and singularly untouched by civilization. He bought a very charming cottage, had various improvements and alterations made, and settled down there most contentedly. His household consisted of his niece Greta, a secretary, an old German servant who had served him faithfully for nearly 40 years, and an outside handyman and gardener who was a native of King's Nathan. "The 4 suspects," said Dr. Lloyd softly. "Exactly. The 4 suspects. There is not much more to tell. Life went on peacefully at King's Nathan for 5 months, and then the blow fell. Dr. Rosen fell down the stairs one morning and was found dead about half an hour later. At the time the accident must have taken place, Gertrude was in her kitchen with the door closed and heard nothing, so she says. Fräulein Greta was in the garden planting some bulbs, again, so she says. The gardener, Dobbs, was in the small potting shed having his elevenses, so he says. And the secretary was out for a walk, and once more there is only his own word for it. No one has an alibi, no one can corroborate anyone else's story. But one thing is certain. No one from outside could have done it, for a stranger in the little village of King's Nathan would be noticed without fail. Both the back and the front doors were locked, each member of the household having their own key. So you see it narrows down to those 4. And yet each one seems to be above suspicion. Greta, his own brother's child. Gertrude, with 40 years of faithful service. Dobbs, who has never been out of King's Nathan. And Charles Templeton, the secretary. Yes, said Colonel Bantry. What about him? He seems the suspicious person to my mind. What do you know about him? It is what I knew about him that put him completely out of court, at any rate at the time, said Sir Henry gravely. You see, Charles Templeton was one of my own men, oh," said Colonel Bantry, considerably taken aback. "Yes. I wanted to have someone on the spot, and at the same time I didn't want to cause talk in the village. Rosen really needed a secretary. I put Templeton on the job. He's a gentleman, he speaks German fluently, and he's altogether a very able fellow, but, then, which do you suspect?" asked Mrs. Bantry in a bewildered tone. "They all seem so, well, impossible, yes, so it appears. But you can look at the thing from another angle. Fräulein Greta was his niece and a very lovely girl, but the war has shown us time and again that brother can turn against sister, or father against son, and so on, and the loveliest and gentlest of young girls did some of the most amazing things. The same thing applies to Gertrude, and who knows what other forces might be at work in her case. A quarrel, perhaps, with her master, a growing resentment all the more lasting because of the long faithful years behind her. Elderly women of that class can be amazingly bitter sometimes, and Dobbs? Was he right outside it because he had no connection with the family? Money will do much. In some way Dobbs might have been approached and bought. For one thing seems certain, some message or some order must have come from outside. Otherwise, why 5 months immunity? No, the agents of the society must have been at work. Not yet sure of Rosen's perfidy, they delayed till the betrayal had been traced to him beyond any possible doubt. And then, all doubts set aside. They must have sent their message to the spy within the gates, the message that said, "Kill." How nasty, said Jane Hellier, and shuddered. But how did the message come? That was the point I tried to elucidate, the one hope of solving my problem. One of those 4 people must have been approached or communicated with in some way. There would be no delay. I knew that, as soon as the command came, it would be carried out. That was a peculiarity of the Schwartz hand. I went into the question. Went into it in a way that will probably strike you as being ridiculously meticulous. Who had come to the cottage that morning? I eliminated nobody. Here is the list. He took an envelope from his pocket and selected a paper from its contents. The butcher, bringing some neck of mutton. Investigated and found correct. The grocer's assistant, bringing a packet of cornflour, 2 pounds of sugar, a pound of butter, and a pound of coffee. Also investigated and found correct. The postman, bringing 2 circulars for Fräulein Rosen, a local letter for Gertrude, 3 letters for Dr. Rosen, 1 with a foreign stamp, and 2 letters for Mr. Templeton, 1 also with a foreign stamp. Sir Henry paused and then took a sheaf of documents from the envelope. It may interest you to see these for yourself. They were handed me by the various people concerned, or collected from the waste paper basket. I need hardly say they've been tested by experts for invisible ink, etc. No excitement of that kind is possible. Everyone crowded round to look. The catalogues were respectively from a nurseryman and from a prominent London fur establishment. The 2 bills addressed to Dr. Rosen were a local one for seeds for the garden and one from a London stationery firm. The letter addressed to him ran as follows: "My dear Rosen, just back from Dr. Helmuth Spath's. I saw Edgar Jackson the other day. He and Amos Perry have just come back from Tsingtao. In all honesty, I can't say I envy them the trip. Let me have news of you soon. As I said before, beware of a certain person. You know who I mean, though you don't agree. Yours, Georgine." Mr. Templeton's mail consisted of this bill, which, as you see, is an account rendered from his tailor, and a letter from a friend in Germany, went on Sir Henry. The latter, unfortunately, he tore up whilst out on his walk. Finally we have the letter received by Gertrude. Dear Mrs. Swartz, we're hoping as how you be able to come the social on Friday evening. The vicar says as he hopes you will, one and all being welcome. The recipe for the ham was very good, and I thanks you for it. Hoping as this finds you well and that we shall see you Friday, I remain. Yours faithfully, Emma Green. Dr. Lloyd smiled a little over this, and so did Mrs. Bantry. I think the last letter can be put out of court, said Dr. Lloyd. I thought the same, said Sir Henry, but I took the precaution of verifying that there was a Mrs. Green and a church social. One can't be too careful, you know, that's what our friend Miss Marple always says, said Dr. Lloyd, smiling. You're lost in a daydream. Miss Marple. What are you thinking out? Miss Marple gave a start. So stupid of me, she said. I was just wondering why the word honesty in Dr. Rosen's letter was spelt with a capital H. Mrs. Bantry picked it up. So it is, she said. Oh. Yes, dear, said Miss Marple. I thought you'd notice. There's a definite warning in that letter, said Colonel Bantry. That's the first thing caught my attention. I notice more than you'd think. Yes, a definite warning, against whom? There's rather a curious point about that letter, said Sir Henry. According to Templeton, Dr. Rosen opened the letter at breakfast and tossed it across to him, saying he didn't know who the fellow was from Adam, but it wasn't a fellow, said Jane Hellier. It was signed Georgina. It's difficult to say which it is, said Dr. Lloyd. It might be Georgie, but it certainly looks more like Georgina. Only it strikes me that the writing is a man's. You know, that's interesting, said Colonel Bantry. His tossing it across the table like that and pretending he knew nothing about it. Wanted to watch somebody's face. Whose face? The girl's? Or the man's? Or even the cook's, suggested Mrs. Bantry. She might have been in the room bringing in the breakfast. But what I don't see is, it's most peculiar. She frowned over the letter. Miss Marple drew closer to her. Miss Marple's finger went out and touched the sheet of paper. They murmured together. But why did the secretary tear up the other letter? Asked Jane Holier suddenly. It seems, oh. I don't know, it seems queer. Why should he have letters from Germany? Although, of course, if he's above suspicion, as you say, but Sir Henry didn't say that, said Miss Marple quickly, looking up from her murmured conference with Mrs. Bantry. He said 4 suspects. So that shows that he includes Mr. Templeton. I'm right, am I not, Sir Henry? Yes, Miss Marple. I have learned one thing through bitter experience. Never say to yourself that anyone is above suspicion. I gave you reasons just now why 3 of these people might after all be guilty, unlikely as it seemed. I did not at that time apply the same process to Charles Templeton. But I came to it at last through pursuing the rule I have just mentioned. And I was forced to recognize this, that every army and every navy and every police force has a certain number of traitors within its ranks. Much as we hate to admit the idea. And I examined dispassionately the case against Charles Templeton. I asked myself very much the same questions as Miss Helier has just asked. Why should he, alone of all the house, not be able to produce the letter he had received, a letter, moreover, with a German stamp on it? Why should he have letters from Germany? The last question was an innocent one, and I actually put it to him. His reply came simply enough. His mother's sister was married to a German. The letter had been from a German girl cousin. So I learned something I did not know before, that Charles Templeton had relations with people in Germany. And that put him definitely on the list of suspects, very much so. He is my own man, a lad I have always liked and trusted, but in common justice and fairness I must admit that H.E. heads that list. But there it is, I do not know. I do not know. And in all probability I never shall know. It is not a question of punishing a murderer. It is a question that to me seems 100 times more important. It is the blighting, perhaps, of an honorable man's whole career. Because of suspicion, a suspicion that I dare not disregard. Miss Marple coughed and said gently, then, Sir Henry, if I understand you rightly, it is this young Mr. Templeton only who is so much on your mind? Yes, in a sense, it should, in theory, be the same for all four, but that is not actually the case. Dobbs, for instance, suspicion may attach to him in my mind, but it will not actually affect his career. Nobody in the village has ever had any idea that old Dr. Rosen's death was anything but an accident. Gertrude is slightly more affected. It must make, for instance, a difference in Fräulein Rosen's attitude toward her, but that, possibly, is not of great importance to her. As for Greta Rosen, well, here we come to the crux of the matter. Greta is a very pretty girl and Charles Templeton is a good-looking young man, and for 5 months they were thrown together with no outer distractions. The inevitable happened, they fell in love with each other, even if they did not come to the point of admitting the fact in words, and then the catastrophe happens. It is 3 months ago now, and a day or two after I returned, Greta Rosen came to see me. She had sold the cottage and was returning to Germany, having finally settled up her uncle's affairs. She came to me personally, although she knew I had retired, because it was really about a personal matter she wanted to see me. She beat about the bush a little, but at last it all came out. What did I think? That letter with the German stamp, she had worried about it and worried about it, the one Charles had torn up. Was it all right? Surely it must be all right. Of course she believed his story, but, oh! If she only knew. If she knew, for certain, you see? The same feeling, the wish to trust, but the horrible lurking suspicion, thrust resolutely to the back of the mind, but persisting nevertheless. I spoke to her with absolute frankness, and asked her to do the same. I asked her whether she had been on the point of caring for Charles, and he for her. I think so, she said. Oh, yes, I know it was so. We were so happy. Every day passed so contentedly. We knew, we both knew. There was no hurry, there was all the time in the world. Some day he would tell me he loved me, and I should tell him that I too, ah. But you can guess. And now it is all changed. A black cloud has come between us, we are constrained, when we meet we do not know what to say. It is, perhaps, the same with him as with me. We are each saying to ourselves, if I were sure. That is why, Sir Henry, I beg of you to say to me. You may be sure, whoever killed your uncle, it was not Charles Templeton. Say it to me. Oh, say it to me. I beg, I beg. And, damn it all, said Sir Henry, bringing down his fist with a bang on the table, I couldn't say it to her. They'll drift farther and farther apart, those two, with suspicion like a ghost between them, a ghost that can't be laid. He leant back in his chair, his face looked tired and gray. He shook his head once or twice despondently. And there's nothing more can be done, unless, he sat up straight again and a tiny whimsical smile crossed his face, unless Miss Marple can help us, can't you, Miss Marple? I've a feeling that letter might be in your line, you know. The one about the church social. Doesn't it remind you of something or someone that makes everything perfectly plain? Can't you do something to help two helpless young people who want to be happy? Behind the whimsicality there was something earnest in his appeal. He had come to think very highly of the mental powers of this frail old-fashioned maiden lady. He looked across at her with something very like hope in his eyes. Miss Marple coughed and smoothed her lace. It does remind me a little of Annie Poultney, she admitted. Of course the letter is perfectly plain, both to Mrs. Bantry and myself. I don't mean the church social letter, but the other one, you living so much in London and not being a gardener, Sir Henry, would not have been likely to notice, eh? Said Sir Henry. Notice what? Mrs. Bantry reached out a hand and selected a catalogue. She opened it and read aloud with gusto, Dr. Helmuth's bath. Pure lilac, a wonderfully fine flower, carried on exceptionally long and stiff stem. Splendid for cutting and garden decoration, a novelty of striking beauty, Edgar Jackson. Beautifully shaped chrysanthemum-like flower of a distinct brick-red color. Amos Perry. Brilliant red, highly decorative, Tsingtao. Brilliant orange red, showy garden plant and lasting cut flower, Honesty, with a capital H, you remember, murmured Miss Marple, Honesty. Rose and white shades, enormous perfect-shaped flower. Mrs. Bantry flung down the catalogue, and said with immense explosive force, Dahlias. And their initial letters spell death, explained Miss Marple, but the letter came to Dr. Rosen himself. Objected Sir Henry. That was the clever part of it, said Miss Marple. That and the warning in it. What would he do, getting a letter from someone he didn't know, full of names he didn't know? Why, of course, toss it over to his secretary, then, after all. Oh, no, said Miss Marple. Not the secretary. Why, that's what makes it so perfectly clear that it wasn't him. He'd never have let that letter be found if so. And equally he'd never have destroyed a letter to himself with a German stamp on it. Really, his innocence is, if you'll allow me to use the word, just shining. Then who? Well, it seems almost certain as anything can be in this world. There was another person at the breakfast table, and she would, quite naturally under the circumstances, put out her hand for the letter and read it. And that would be that. You remember that she got a gardening catalogue by the same post, Greta Rosen, said Sir Henry, slowly. Then her visit to me. Gentlemen never see through these things, said Miss Marple. And I'm afraid they often think we old women are, well, cats, to see things the way we do. But there it is. One does know a great deal about one's own sex, unfortunately. I've no doubt there was a barrier between them. The young man felt a sudden inexplicable repulsion. He suspected, purely through instinct, and couldn't hide the suspicion. And I really think that the girl's visit to you was just pure spite. She was safe enough really, but she just went out of her way to fix your suspicions definitely on poor Mr. Templeton. You weren't nearly so sure about him until after her visit. I'm sure it was nothing that she said, began Sir Henry. Gentlemen, said Miss Marple calmly, never see through these things, and that girl, he stopped. She commits a cold-blooded murder and gets off scot-free. Oh. No, Sir Henry, said Miss Marple. Not scot-free. Neither you nor I believe that. Remember what you said not long ago. No. Greta Rosen will not escape punishment. To begin with, she must be in with a very queer set of people, blackmailers and terrorists, associates who will do her no good, and will probably bring her to a miserable end. As you say, one mustn't waste thoughts on the guilty, it's the innocent who matter. Mr. Templeton, who I dare say will marry that German cousin, his tearing up her letter looks, well, it looks suspicious, using the word in quite a different sense from the one we've been using all the evening. A little as though he were afraid of the other girl noticing or asking to see it? Yes. I think there must have been some little romance there. And then there's Dobbs, though, as you say, I dare say it won't matter much to him. His allowances are probably all he thinks about. And then there's that poor old Gertrude, the one who reminded me of Annie Poultney. Poor Annie Poultney. 50 years faithful service and suspected of making away with Miss Lamb's will, though nothing could be proved, almost broke the poor creature's faithful heart, and then after she was dead it came to light in the secret drawer of the tea caddy where old Miss Lamb had put it herself for safety. But too late then for poor Annie. That's what worries me so about that poor old German woman. When one is old, one becomes embittered very easily. I felt much more sorry for her than for Mr. Templeton, who is young and good-looking and evidently a favorite with the ladies. You will write to her, won't you, Sir Henry, and just tell her that her innocence is established beyond doubt? Her dear old master dead, and she no doubt brooding and feeling herself suspected of. Oh! It won't bear thinking about. I will write, Miss Marple, said Sir Henry. He looked at her curiously. You know, I shall never quite understand you. Your outlook is always a different one from what I expect. My outlook, I am afraid, is a very petty one, said Miss Marple humbly. I hardly ever go out of St. Mary Mead, and yet you have solved what may be called an international mystery, said Sir Henry. For you have solved it. I am convinced of that. Miss Marple blushed, then bridled a little. I was, I think, well educated for the standard of my day. My sister and I had a German governess, a Fräulein. A very sentimental creature. She taught us the language of flowers, a forgotten study nowadays, but most charming. A yellow tulip, for instance, means hopeless love, whilst a China aster means I die of jealousy at your feet. That letter was signed Georgine, which I seem to remember is Dahlia in German, and that of course made the whole thing perfectly clear. I wish I could remember the meaning of Dahlia, but alas, that eludes me. My memory is not what it was. At any rate it didn't mean death. No, indeed. Horrible, is it not? There are very sad things in the world, there are, said Mrs. Bantry with a sigh. It's lucky one has flowers and one's friends, she puts us last, you observe, said Dr. Lloyd. A man used to send me purple orchids every night to the theatre, said Jane dreamily. I await your favors, that's what that means. Said Miss Marple brightly. Sir Henry gave a peculiar sort of cough and turned his head away. Miss Marple gave a sudden exclamation. I've remembered. Dahlias mean treachery and misrepresentation. Wonderful, said Sir Henry. Absolutely wonderful, and he sighed.